Now I'd like to introduce an amazing woman who I just met. Margaret was an expert member on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's the director, Indigenous Women Environmental Conservation Project, chairperson for Civil Society for Indigenous Organization in Karamojong, Indigenous Women and Girls Leadership and Well-Being in Uganda. Margaret has been a teacher and social worker for 15 years. She has her master's in human rights and development, a degree in conflict resolution, a teacher's diploma, along with numerous certificates in the field of Indigenous peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Lokawua.
As I've already been introduced, my name's Margaret Lokawua. I appreciate and I'm humbled to be here at the invitation of the Seventh Generation Fund, at Parliament of World Religions. Ladies and gentlemen, Mata, greetings from my elders. They send you love and greetings on the other side of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, in my presentation, I first wanted us to understand whom we are as Indigenous peoples. The term Indigenous peoples comprises of 500 million people spread across the countries and the whole world. It's a term used to categorize a population who inhabited a country or a region prior to colonization and other settlers. Ladies and gentlemen, given the diversity of Indigenous peoples, the notion of universal definition becomes unnecessary and undesirable. Instead, establishing certain criteria to identify and recognize them wherever they are located was considered to be imperative. This is according to ILO 169, for most of us who are familiar. And we also say they descend from populations who inhabited a country or a geographical region at the time of conquest, colonization, or establishment of current state boundaries. Indigenous people retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, irrespective of their legal status. They have social, cultural, economic conditions that distinguish them from other sections of the community. We have Indigenous peoples in the whole world, and for my case, I represent Indigenous people called Karamojong in the northern eastern part of Uganda. Ladies and gentlemen, in practice, the human rights of Indigenous peoples remain without specifically designated safeguards. Indigenous people continue to face serious threats to their basic existence due to systematic government policies that discriminate them. In many countries, they rank highest on the scale of underdevelopment indicators. The proportion of people are in jail, illiteracy rates, unemployment, among others. They face discrimination in schools and are exploited in the workplace. In many countries, they are not even allowed to study in their own languages. And so this is a very serious challenge. Now we've got the instruments that recognize Indigenous peoples. I just wanted to mention a few. We have got the Declaration on Human Rights, that was of 1948. We have got the ILO Convention 169, and then we have got the famous instrument, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Brothers and sisters, I would want to say something about women in particular. Indigenous women around the world suffer the same human rights abuses that perpetrate against indigenous men, including forced relocation from their ancestral lands, pollution and destruction of waters and territories, and limitation to education and health care, among others. And so, indigenous women suffer multiple human rights discrimination than men. Now, like any other nation, we have got instruments. We have got legal frameworks that protect indigenous people. We have got, in some countries, and in some countries, indigenous people are not recognized. We have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights on indigenous peoples that I've just mentioned, and I want to highlight Article 22, which states that particular attention should be paid to the rights and special needs of indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. And then we have got Article 3, which provides the right to self-determination for indigenous people. And we say self-determination is defined as both a choice to determine political status, as well as the right to have autonomy over economic, social, and cultural developments. Self-determination is a right in itself and has been conceptualized as a condition of the fulfillment of other rights. In summary, the Declaration is an international human rights instrument considered the most significant accomplishment in the protection of people's rights, and in its 46 articles. For the purpose of recitation, the Declaration outlines a basic framework for recognizing the human rights of indigenous peoples in the key areas such as self-determination, language, culture, identity, education, territories, resources, among others. Ladies and gentlemen, I want now to go to the revitalization of indigenous women in Uganda and also other states. Now, for example, household food security is a big role played by women to ensure that their communities have enough foods. Indigenous women are often responsible to their families, and more than men who, in most cases, move away to towns. Another one is poverty alleviation. Given this scenario, women, in most cases, are introduced to initiatives that support them in their own various communities. But at times, these conditions are given with the preconditions that do not take care into account, that are not sensitive to indigenous women. Another one I would cite is promotion of reproductive health and sexual rights to indigenous women. In this case, first of all, indigenous women experience high levels of maternal and infant mortality, malnutrition, HIV/AIDS, and other infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis. Children mortality rates among indigenous women is usually above the national average in most communities. Many of those poor health outcomes are influenced by formidable risks such as drug abuse, poor nutrition, alcoholism, which have worryingly increased within indigenous communities. And so you find that because of this, sometimes it is very hard for indigenous women who are family caregivers to provide all the basic needs, such as funds to take their kids to get treatment. It's really a challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many things that we can look at in revitalization of indigenous knowledge by women in their communities. Another one can be secure to land rights. Such land rights also help indigenous persons to continue their vital role in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Recognizing an entire community's right to its ancestral territories is more effective than recognizing rights for individuals, as the latter makes it easier for predatory industries and governments to steal land of these indigenous peoples in small pieces. So sometimes to have a collective voice could be better. We have food production. Indigenous peoples globally are actively shaping, nurturing, and fostering healthy and sustainable communities through their self-determination efforts and decolonization strategies. A critical area in this regard is food. Food sovereignty movements initiated, for example, in 1996 by transnational organizations of peasants, La Via Campesina, representing 148 organizations from 69 countries, called for the rights of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food for them to determine. This movement calls for indigenizing food, moving it beyond the right-based discourse. And this is one of the examples. This is one of the ways women can revitalize their indigenous communities. Climate change mitigation. In most cases, women encourage the planting of indigenous trees. Such organizations like mine that I have in my community, we have more than 200 women. And one of the issues we look at is environmental issues. And so we plant trees because we know we are attached to trees in so many ways. We worship, they keep our sacred places, we get medicinal foods, we get medicinal plants, and so forth. And so by protecting the environment, I think it's a very good step that indigenous women can hold, can revitalize their communities. Conflict resolution and peace building is another key area that indigenous women play a role. Women organizations and others support women in the case of conflicts over land and natural resources, which remain a defining factor for many lives of indigenous peoples. And by this, it promotes coexistence, which is very important, and women have been so much good at that. Another one is education. We realize that if indigenous women do not emphasize indigenous education, use of languages, then the societies are going to die. And I think that is one of the very important areas that women can use to revitalize the language, and the women should encourage the use of local languages in the formation of curriculums, because sometimes the second language that was imported to indigenous peoples do not even define certain animals. They do not define certain plants. And it's very hard for a child to relate in an indigenous language the attachment of a certain kind of species. I know very well, we know it better. There are some plants that an English word or a foreign word cannot explain. And in such, it is important for us, indigenous women, to emphasize the use of our own languages in schools. Other indigenous people are doing that, others are not. use of modern technology to preserve ancient culture. Women have also promoted the use of technology among indigenous women, using modern technology, for example, to preserve ancient cultures that have been destroyed. And we have so many examples. And it is one of the things that we should revive. It is one of the things that identifies whom we are, and that is why in the first beginning of my introduction, I emphasized, I re-echoed what we already know, that you should know your identity. You should know where you are coming from so that you can move forward and make the future. The other one is safeguarding the intangible cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. Women are actively involved in efforts towards safeguarding. Most communities, I think, do that. The intangible cultural heritage of the indigenous communities at various levels, including decision-making at policy level and management. In 2003, states endorsed unintentional instruments to provide for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage of humanity across the globe. There have been efforts worldwide to increase the participation of women in this discord. I think this is very important because we must be involved as an indigenous woman. We must be involved in preserving our cultural heritage. We must be involved to take decision. We must be involved to speak for what is right. I think that is a very powerful message for us women and indigenous communities. We have so many examples. I have a case of a cultural heritage in my own country of a tribe called the Basongora, who had a long history. And from that community was one of the great rulers of the Bunyoro Kitara around 1700s. So you can see even in other communities, maybe we have forgotten this. But we need to know our history. And it is the history that shapes us as indigenous peoples. It is the history that determines our destiny. Because if you don't know your history, then you are nobody. And as indigenous women, it is a high time we looked at those areas. Therefore, there should be measures to safeguard, preserve all our traditions. But this should be sensitive, gender sensitive, responsive, and women should be involved at all levels, as I've already mentioned. Oral traditions should be sufficiently reclaimed through research and documentation, and its knowledge made available and accessible for education, information, adaptation to development strategies. Feminist research methods should be used to bring out the perspective of women, and women researchers should be encouraged to do so. You know, I feel proud if a report of a woman, if a research made by indigenous women is read such a gathering. It will be so great. And it makes us feel proud as indigenous women. In conclusion, women play a very critical role in revitalization of indigenous knowledge in our communities. These roles, as I've already mentioned, range from poverty alleviation, traditional knowledge, spirituality, environmental knowledge, health issues, and many others. If we embark this as indigenous women with the support of our brothers, I think we can change. We shall remain united. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I met Margaret at the United Nations Permanent Forum this past fall in New York City, and established a bit of a friendship with her. So I really got to know her, and really happy that she's here. Quite a journey to come from where she comes from in Africa. She has to not only travel from her home community to the nearest port where she can get to another country to actually come here. She actually has to get a visa from that country to make the travel here. So it's quite an effort. And then she texted me from Amsterdam the day before, just a bit worried about how she's going to get from the airport to her hotel. So another big hand for Margaret.